They tell us that power is a loan. It is never owned. You borrow it from fear. You borrow it from money. You borrow it from violence. And like any loan, it has to be paid back, and the interest rate is always, always higher than you can afford. Pablo Escobar thought he could buy the world, but in the end he couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. He thought he commanded armies, but in the end he died with one terrified kid by his side. He thought he was a god, but in the end he was just a body on a roof, wet with rain, waiting for the van to take him to the morgue. We look at his life and we see the explosions, the planes, the billions, but we should look at his death. We should look at the isolation. We should look at the silence. We build our castles. We hoard our wealth. We draw our lines in the sand. We tell ourselves that we are safe. We tell ourselves that we are in control. But we are all just waiting in a room with the curtains drawn. We are all just listening to the static. We are all just one phone call away from the roof. And when the door breaks open, when the footsteps come up the stairs, it doesn't matter how much money you have in the jungle. It doesn't matter how many people fear your name. All that matters is who is on the other end of the line. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.
Pablo Escobar thought he could buy the world, but in the end he couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. He thought he commanded armies, but in the end he died with one terrified kid by his side. He thought he was a god, but in the end he was just a body on a roof, wet with rain, waiting for the van to take him to the morgue. We look at his life and we see the explosions, the planes, the billions. But we should look at his death. We should look at the isolation. We should look at the silence. We build our castles. We hoard our wealth. We draw our lines in the sand. We tell ourselves that we are safe. We tell ourselves that we are in control. But we are all just waiting in a room with the curtains drawn. We are all just listening to the static. We are all just one phone call away from the roof. And when the door breaks open, when the footsteps come up the stairs, it doesn't matter how much money you have in the jungle. It doesn't matter how many people fear your name. All that matters is who is on the other end of the line. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury. The rain in Medellín does not wash things clean. It seals them in. It presses down on the valley like a wet gray thumb, trapping the exhaust, the humidity, and the secrets of 3 million people. On the afternoon of December 2nd, 1993, the rain was relentless. It drummed against the tin roofs of the favelas. It pooled in the potholes of the highways. And in a middle-class neighborhood called Los Olivos, it fell on the roof of a 2-story brick row house where a ghost was learning how to die. The house was unremarkable. It had a garage, a small balcony, and windows that looked out onto a street where life was proceeding with terrifying normality. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A woman walked her dog under a yellow umbrella. A teenager rode a bicycle, swerving around puddles. None of them looked up. None of them knew that behind the drawn curtains of the second floor, the most hunted man in the history of the Western Hemisphere was eating a plate of spaghetti and staring at a telephone.
He was not the man from the photographs. The photographs showed a titan. They showed a man standing in front of the White House, or sitting on a motorcycle, or raising a glass of champagne with the confidence of a king. This man was different. He was heavy. His stomach pushed against a blue t-shirt that was 2 sizes too small. His beard was thick, unruly, growing high on his cheeks, hiding a face that had aged 20 years in the last 12 months. His eyes were red-rimmed, sinking into pockets of dark flesh. He wasn't moving. He was barely breathing. He was just looking at the phone. For 15 years, the telephone had been his weapon. With a phone, he had ordered the deaths of judges. With a phone, he had moved tons of cocaine across oceans. With a phone, he had negotiated the surrender of a government. The phone was his scepter. It was the instrument through which his will became reality. But now, the phone was a bomb. He knew it. The men in the room with him knew it. There was only one other man there, a bodyguard named Limon, who was young, loyal, and visibly trembling. Limon stood by the door, his hand resting on the grip of a submachine gun, his eyes darting between his boss and the window. He knew the rule. Everyone knew the rule. 2 minutes. That was the limit. That was the law. You never stayed on the line for more than 2 minutes. The Americans had brought in technology that was beyond comprehension. Planes that circled in the stratosphere, vans that prowled the streets with spinning antennas, computers that could triangulate a voice in the time it took to say a prayer. 2 minutes was the difference between a conversation and a coffin. Pablo Escobar knew this better than anyone. He had written the manual on evasion. He had survived thousands of raids, thousands of searches, because he respected the silence. But on this afternoon, the silence was killing him. He reached out. His hand was steady, but his fingers were swollen. He picked up the receiver. The dial tone hummed, a flat, monotonous note. He dialed the number for the Hotel Tequendama in Bogotá. He waited. 1 ring, 2 rings. Hello? The voice was young. It was his son, Juan Pablo. The man on the bed let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. His shoulders slumped. The tension that held his body in a rigid state of combat dissolved, replaced by a desperate, aching exhaustion. "Juan," he said, "how is your mother?" He didn't ask about the police. He didn't ask about the cartel. He didn't ask about the money buried in the jungle or the enemies closing in from the north. He asked about his wife. He looked at his watch. The second hand began its sweep. 0. "She is crying, Papa," the boy said. "They are threatening to deport us. They say we have to leave the country, but no country will take us." 5 seconds. "Tell her to be strong," Pablo said. "Tell her that I am fixing it. Tell her that everything is going to be fine." 10 seconds. He was lying. He knew he was lying. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't even fix the window latch in the bathroom, let alone the geopolitical forces arrayed against his family. But he couldn't stop talking. The sound of his son's voice was a drug. It was the only thing that made him feel like a human being, not an animal being flushed from a hole. 15 seconds. Outside, 3 blocks away, a white van turned onto the street. It moved slowly, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. Inside the van, a technician wearing heavy headphones watched a green line spike on a monitor. He tapped the shoulder of the officer next to him. He didn't speak. He just pointed. The officer picked up a radio. "We have a signal," he whispered. "It is him. He is stationary." 20 seconds. In the bedroom, Limon took a step forward. He gestured at his wrist. He was begging his boss to hang up. "Patron, please." Pablo ignored him. He was lost in the connection. He was trying to parent from 300 miles away. He was trying to be the father he had promised to be, even as the walls of his reality were closing in. 30 seconds. "The journalist. She said you were a monster," the boy said. "The journalist is a liar," Pablo snapped. His voice rose. The old fire flickered. They lie because they are weak. They lie because they are weak. Do not listen to them. You know who I am. 40 seconds. The white van stopped. A second van turned the corner at the far end of the block. A third vehicle, an unmarked taxi, pulled up to the alleyway behind the row of houses. The net was not just closing, it was cinched. 50 seconds. I know, Papa, but I am scared. Don't be scared. Never let them see you scared. He should have hung up. Logic, survival, instinct, all of it screamed at him to sever the line. But he couldn't. He physically couldn't. The fear in his son's voice paralyzed him. He needed to comfort him. He needed to stay on the line until the boy stopped crying. He was trading seconds of life for seconds of comfort. 1 minute. The signal was strong now. The triangulation was complete. The crosshairs on the map in the command center had settled directly over the roof of the house in Los Olivos. The order was given. Troops began to move. They moved silently, hugging the walls, their boots avoiding the puddles, their weapons raised. Pablo kept talking. He was rambling now. He was making promises he couldn't keep. He was talking about the future. He was talking about peace. 1 minute. 20 seconds. Limon was pacing. He was sweating. He looked like he was about to vomit.
Then Pablo heard it. It wasn't a siren. It wasn't a shout. It was a sound so subtle that only a man who had lived in a state of war for a decade would have noticed it. It was the sound of a heavy metal door unlatching downstairs. The click of the lock, the groan of a hinge. The silence of the house broke. Pablo stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went wide. He looked at the door of the bedroom. He looked at the phone in his hand. Wait, I'll call you back. He hung up. The line went dead. The green line on the monitor in the van went flat, but it didn't matter anymore. The ghost had stayed visible for too long. He stood up. The bed springs creaked. He looked at Limon. There was no need for words. They both heard the footsteps now. Heavy, fast, many. They were on the stairs. They're here, Pablo whispered. And in that moment, he didn't reach for his radio to call for backup. He didn't reach for his millions. He reached for a pistol that felt like a toy in his hand. He looked at the window, the gray light spilling through the curtains, and he realized with a clarity that was cold and absolute that he had just made the last phone call of his life. If you're drawn to the untold stories of power, betrayal, and men who ruled through fear rather than noise, you're already in the right place. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. There is a version of this story that you have been told. It is the action movie version. It is the version where Pablo Escobar was a mastermind who was finally outsmarted by a brilliant team of specialized hunters. It is the version that justice prevailed through superior firepower and tactical genius. That is the comfortable version. That is the version that allows governments to sleep at night. But that is not what happened. The truth is that by December of 1993, Pablo Escobar was not outsmarted. He was not outgunned. He simply stopped running. The man who died on that rooftop was not the head of a cartel. He was a man whose mind had been dismantled, piece by piece, not by bullets, but by isolation. He was a man who had been stripped of every layer of insulation until his nerves were exposed to the air. The story of his fall is not a story of military strategy. It is a psychological horror story.
It is a case study in what happens to a human being, no matter how powerful, is completely and utterly cut off from the world he tried to own. This story will permanently change how you understand power, loyalty, fear, and control. Because in the end, it wasn't the police who killed Pablo Escobar. It was the silence. To understand the end, you have to understand the height. You have to understand what he fell from. 3 years ago, Pablo Escobar was not hiding in a row house. He was the host of the party. He had built his own prison, La Catedral, which was less of a jail and more of a fortress resort. He had jacuzzis, he had a disco, he had a soccer field where professional players came to entertain him. He invited the national team to play private matches. He controlled the guards, he controlled the air traffic, he controlled the president. He was intouchable. He had proven that the state was an abstract concept and that silver and lead were the only real laws of physics. But power is a narcotic, and like all narcotics, it builds tolerance. You need more of it to feel the same high. And eventually, the high stops coming, and you are left only with the side effects. The side effect of absolute power is absolute paranoia.
When he escaped La Catedral in July of 1992, walking out the back gate into the fog of the Andes, he thought he was returning to his kingdom. He thought the people of Medellín would rise up to protect him. He thought his army of sicarios, the young men from the slums who worshipped him like a messiah, would form a wall of flesh around him that the government could not penetrate. He was wrong. The world he stepped back into had changed. He had been away for a year, and in the drug trade, a year is a century. New players had emerged. The Cali cartel, his rivals to the south, had not been idle. They had been watching. They had been learning. They had realized that you cannot fight Pablo Escobar with bombs because he loves bombs. You cannot fight him with terror because he invented terror. You fight him with business. You fight him with money. You fight him by buying the very people he thinks he owns. The first few months on the run were chaotic. There were car bombs. There were assassinations. The city of Medellín became a slaughterhouse. Every police officer had a bounty on his head. $500 for a dead cop, $2,000 for a sergeant. The streets ran with blood. But this time, the violence didn't work. The government didn't fold. The Americans didn't back down. Instead, they escalated. They sent Delta Force. They sent Navy SEALs. They sent the DEA. They flooded the country with surveillance technology that Pablo couldn't even imagine. And then a new group appeared, Los Pepes. People persecuted by Pablo Escobar. That's what the acronym stood for. They were a death squad. But they weren't just any death squad. They were funded by the Cali cartel, protected by the police, and fed intelligence by the Americans. They were the monster created to kill the monster. And they didn't play by Pablo's rules. They didn't target him. They targeted his support system. They killed his lawyers. They killed his accountants. They burned down his mother's farm. They bombed his properties. They went after the families of his guards. They sent a message that was crystal clear. If you stand next to Pablo Escobar, you will die. If you work for him, you will die. If you speak his name, you will die. This was the beginning of the isolation. The circle began to shrink. The lieutenants, the men who had been with him from the days of smuggling stereo equipment and cigarettes, began to disappear. Some were killed, some surrendered, some simply vanished, taking their money
and running to Miami or Madrid, realizing that the ship was sinking and the captain was insane. By the middle of 1993, the king was living in basements. He moved every 2 days. He traveled in the trunks of taxicabs, breathing exhaust fumes, curled up in the fetal position. He ate cold arepas and drank warm soda. He couldn't go outside. He couldn't look out the window. He couldn't trust the sun. The luxury was gone. The ego remained, but it was starving.
He began to notice things, small things, the way a bodyguard looked at him when he asked for water, the hesitation before an order was carried out, the whispers that stopped when he entered a room. He started to clean. It became a compulsion. He would spend hours cleaning the bathroom of a safe house, scrubbing the tiles, polishing the mirror. He would organize his clothes, what few he had left, by color. He would trim his beard with nail scissors, obsessed with a symmetry that no longer existed in his life. It was the mind trying to impose order on chaos. It was the behavior of a man who has lost control of his empire, so he tries to control the dust. The silence grew louder. In the old days, there was always noise, music, parties, shouting, engines. Now there was only the sound of the fan, the sound of the rain, and the sound of his own breathing. He started talking to himself. He would dictate letters to the president, to the United Nations, to the Pope. He would pace the room, dictating these long, rambling manifestos about justice and human rights, while Limon sat in the corner, nodding, pretending to write it down, knowing that these letters would never be sent, that nobody was listening anymore. He was screaming into the void, and the void was staring back. The turning point, the moment when the running stopped and the dying began, came not with a bullet, but with a suitcase. It was October. The pressure was unbearable. The government was squeezing his family. His wife, Victoria, and his 2 children were living in a state of terror. Every day there were threats. Every day they were moved to a new location. Pablo couldn't protect them. He couldn't send them money. He couldn't even send them a word of comfort without risking their lives. He made a decision, a desperate, impossible decision. He would send them away. He would get them out of Colombia. He would send them to Germany. It was a Hail Mary pass. He used his last connections, his last bribes to get them passports and tickets. He sent them to the airport. He watched it on the news. He sat in a safe house, huddled in front of a small black and white television, watching the grainy footage of his wife and children walking through the terminal in Bogotá. He saw the fear in their eyes. He saw the way the cameras swarmed them. He saw his son trying to be brave, holding his little sister's hand.
They got on the plane. They flew across the Atlantic. They landed in Frankfurt. And they were sent back. The German government refused them entry. The Americans had pressured them. The Colombian government had pressured them. The world had conspired to ensure that Pablo Escobar's family had nowhere to go. He watched the return. He watched them get off the plane in Bogotá, exhausted, defeated, humiliated. He watched them being herded into a government van and taken to the Hotel Tequendama, where they would be held as virtual hostages. That broke him. It wasn't the loss of money. It wasn't the loss of territory. It was the realization that his power, which he thought was infinite, could not do the one thing a father is supposed to do: protect his children. He sat in that room for 3 days without speaking. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just stared at the wall. His bodyguards were terrified. They had seen him angry. They had seen him violent. They had never seen him defeated. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. It was hollow. The rage was gone, replaced by a deep, crushing melancholy. "They want me," he said. "They don't want the money. They don't want the roots. They want me." He knew then that there was no escape. He knew that as long as he was alive, his family would be targeted. As long as he was breathing, his son would be a pariah. The logic of the predator kicked in. If the pack is hunting you to get to your cubs, you don't hide. You draw them out. You reveal yourself. You make yourself the target so that the cubs can survive. This is the secret that the history books miss. They say he got careless. They say he got sloppy. They say he slipped up. He didn't slip up. He gave up. Or rather, he changed the objective. The objective was no longer survival. The objective was resolution. November turned to December. The rain got heavier. The noose got tighter. The search block, the special police unit tasked with hunting him, was operating with a new intensity. They were tired, too. They had been away from their families for months. They had buried their friends. They were motivated by a vengeance that was personal and raw. They were using the French technology, radio direction finding. It was a game of geometry. 3 vans, 3 antennas, 3 lines on a map. Where the lines crossed, the target lived. Pablo knew this. He had spies in the police. He knew about the vans. He knew about the 2-minute rule. He had executed men for violating it. But in those final days, the rule became irrelevant. He was alone in the house in Los Olivos with Limon. He had dismissed the others. He sent them away. Go, save yourselves. It was an act of mercy, or perhaps an act of suicide. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want an army. He wanted to be alone with his fate. He turned 44 on November 1st. He celebrated with a cake, a bottle of wine, and marijuana. He sat on the bed, smoking, eating the cake with his hands. He sang happy birthday to himself. It is a pathetic image. The king of cocaine, the man who burned $2 million in cash just to keep his daughter warm, sitting in a dark room, high and drunk, celebrating the passage of time in a life that had run out of it. But there is a strange dignity in it, too, a refusal to let the darkness take everything. The next day, December 2nd, he woke up with a headache. The sky was the color of a bruise. He ate breakfast. He read the newspaper, El Tiempo. The headline was about him. It always was. It said the end was near. It quoted the president saying that Escobar was a cornered rat. He threw the paper on the floor. "Rat," he muttered. "I am not a rat. I am a man." He looked at the phone. The urge to call his family was a physical pain. It was an addiction stronger than the cocaine he sold. He needed to hear them. He needed to know they were still there. He needed to apologize. He knew the vans were out there. He could feel them. He had a sixth sense for danger, a prickling on the back of his neck that had saved him a dozen times. But he didn't care. He picked up the phone, and the rest is physics. The signal left the antenna. It traveled at the speed of light. It bounced off the mountains. It was caught by the receiver in the white van. The needle jumped. The line spiked. The technician nodded. The officer whispered. The soldiers moved. When he hung up the phone that final time, when he heard the door crash open downstairs, there was no panic. Panic is what you feel when you think you can escape. When you know you can't, there is only clarity. He grabbed his gun, the Sig Sauer P226, a beautiful weapon, Swiss engineering. It had never been fired in anger. It was a symbol of his authority. Now it was just a piece of metal. He looked at Limon. "Let's go," he said.
It wasn't a battle cry. It was an invitation to the end. Limon went out the window first. He was young. He still had hope. He thought if he could just make it to the roof, if he could just make it to the alley, maybe he could run. Maybe he could disappear. He hit the roof tiles. He scrambled. He stood up. The gunfire from the street was deafening. It wasn't individual shots. It was a wall of noise, a tear in the fabric of the afternoon. Limon danced. That's what it looks like when a human body is hit by multiple high-velocity rounds. It jerks, it twists, it dances a grotesque puppet-like jig. He fell backward. He slid down the roof. He hit the ground with a sound like a wet sack of cement. Pablo heard it. He was standing by the window. He saw his last soldier die. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. He holstered his gun. He climbed onto the windowsill. He was heavy. He wheezed with the effort. He swung his leg over. He stepped onto the roof. The air was cool. The rain was wet on his face. He looked out at the city of Medellín, his city, the city he had built, the city he had destroyed, the city that loved him, the city that hated him. He saw the soldiers in the alley. He saw the police on the neighboring roofs. He saw the glint of the scopes. He was on a stage. The curtains were open. The audience was waiting. He drew his gun. He didn't aim. He didn't try to take anyone with him. He fired into the air. Pop, pop, pop. It was a gesture. It was a statement. I am here. I am armed. I am Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, and I am not hiding under the bed. The return fire came from everywhere. The roof tiles exploded around him. Shards of red clay flew like shrapnel. A bullet hit his leg. He stumbled. Another hit his shoulder. He spun around. He was limping now. He was moving toward the edge of the roof, toward the back of the house. Maybe he thought he could jump. Maybe he thought he could fly. Or maybe he just wanted to see the mountains one last time. He reached the peak of the roof. He paused. For a fraction of a second, he stood tall, the silhouette of the fat man against the gray sky. And then, the final shot. It came from a rifle, or maybe a pistol. The debate still rages. Was it a sniper from the Delta Force? Was it a policeman named Hugo Aguilar? Was it Pablo himself reaching up behind his ear to deliver the final mercy? It doesn't matter. The bullet entered behind the right ear. It passed through the brain. It exited above the left ear. The lights went out. The thought process, the memories, the ambition, the cruelty, the love for his children, the hatred for the state, all of it, instantly, permanently erased. He fell forward. His knees buckled. His face hit the tiles. He slid a few inches and stopped. The king was dead. The silence returned.
Then a shout. Viva Colombia! It started as a whisper, then a scream, then a chant. The soldiers broke discipline. They rushed the house. They climbed the stairs. They climbed out the window. They gathered around the body. They didn't pray. They didn't salute. They took out cameras. They grabbed his limp arms. They lifted his head by the hair. They smiled. They posed. They gave thumbs up. It was a scene of medieval barbarism. The hunter standing over the prey. The trophy photo. It was the image that would be flashed around the world within hours. The proof that the monster was mortal. But look closely at that photo. Look at the faces of the police. They are smiling, yes, but there is something else in their eyes. Relief, yes, but also fear. A lingering, residual fear, as if they are afraid he might wake up, as if they are afraid even dead he is dangerous. And they were right, because the death of Pablo Escobar didn't fix anything. The next day, thousands of people, the poor, the forgotten, the people of the barrios, lined up at the morgue. They wept. They threw flowers. They called him a saint. To them, he wasn't a terrorist. He was the only man who had ever looked at them and seen human beings. And the drugs? The cocaine? It didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. The Cali cartel took over, then the Norte del Valle cartel, then the paramilitaries, then the guerrillas. The business became more efficient, more corporate, less violent, but bigger than ever. Pablo was a dam. He held back the flood, and when he broke, the waters drowned the country. His death revealed the terrible truth about the drug war. It wasn't about one man. It was about a market. It was about demand. As long as the world wanted cocaine, there would always be a Pablo Escobar. Maybe not as loud, maybe not as famous, but just as ruthless. But what about the man himself? What about the final 48 hours? What do they tell us about power? They tell us that power is a loan. It is never owned. You borrow it from fear. You borrow it from money. You borrow it from violence. And like any loan, it has to be paid back, and the interest rate is always, always higher than you can afford. Pablo Escobar thought he could buy the world, but in the end, he couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. He thought he commanded armies, but in the end, he died with one terrified kid by his side. He thought he was a god, but in the end, he was just a body on a roof, wet with rain, waiting for the van to take him to the morgue. We look at his life and we see the explosions, the planes, the billions. But we should look at his death. We should look at the isolation. We should look at the silence. We build our castles. We hoard our wealth. We draw our lines in the sand. We tell ourselves that we are safe. We tell ourselves that we are in control. But we are all just waiting in a room with the curtains drawn. We are all just listening to the static. We are all just one phone call away from the roof. And when the door breaks open, when the footsteps come up the stairs, it doesn't matter how much money you have in the jungle. It doesn't matter how many people fear your name. All that matters is who is on the other end of the line. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.